Hey everybody, it is good to be back again, and we're going to continue looking at some of the different character traits or qualities of somebody who is going to be a shepherd. The one that we're talking about today is the idea of being a recent convert. And so when we think about recent convert, we tend to think somebody who has been a Christian for a very short period of time. And when we talk about not a new convert, we tend to think of somebody who has been a Christian for decades rather than a shorter period of time. But when we get to the biblical text, we're going to find some things that are a little confusing, to say the least. So let's kind of just start off with asking this question. If we're talking about somebody who's a recent convert, converted to what? That's going to kind of help us understand where we're coming from. Are we talking about somebody who's a brand new Christian? They've just been converted to belief that Jesus is the Messiah. Or are we talking about somebody who has been converted to belief in Yahweh as the one true living God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this Holy Trinity? What are we talking about? That's important because in the ancient world, when Christianity is being spread, you have a very large population of people who already would have been converted to Yahweh, the Jews, right? The Hebrew people. And so stepping from Judaism over to Christianity would have been a very small thing. And we'll talk some more about that in just a minute. But moving into Christianity from a pagan religion, somebody who'd never heard of this one true God, and then now having to acquaint yourself with all the writings, come to see the prophecies, how they're fulfilled in Jesus, that's a much bigger gap. And so the question is, the first thing we need to ask is converted to what? Or to whom? And so maybe the best way to answer that, or the easiest way to answer that, is start off with the word recent. What does the word recent mean? If it refers to somebody who has just come to a knowledge of God, well, that kind of helps us understand what we're talking about when we ask that other question, converted to whom? Converted to Christ, converted to Yahweh in general. Let's look at the biblical text and see when we have some people who become shepherds and how long they had been believers. That will kind of help us get a feel for what we're looking at. And so we're going to turn over to Acts chapter 14. And so if you've got your Bible with you, just turn over there. And in Acts chapter 14, we're actually going to see some people who are converted and then who are later appointed as shepherds. And this actually begins a little bit earlier in chapter 13 when Paul begins his first missionary journey. So in our biblical text, what we see is Paul and Barnabas are traveling around and they're going different places. And in the first 7 verses here, they're going to be preaching in Iconium, and they're going to be driven out of Iconium, and they're going to begin on their way to Lystra and Derbe. The next place they're going to go is in Lystra, and we're going to see that in the next section of verses. And so this is all happening. They're going to go to Antioch, to Iconium, to Lystra, to Derbe. They're going to go in these places in a period of about 2 years. Some people want to stretch out to 3 years, and that's okay. We'll do that. We'll say 3 years is kind of the outer parameter, the longest that this trip is. So we've got a 3-year long journey, which Paul and Barnabas are going around to these different places, talking about Jesus, converting people, by and large, converting Jews. Most of the people converted in this first trip are going to be Jewish. So let's get to the next section, verses 8 then, down through around verse 18. So a bigger chunk of time when they're in Lystra. They're going to go into the city. They're going to heal somebody. There's going to be a lot of commotion. People are going to come and call them gods. A priest is going to come and is going to try and offer sacrifices to Zeus and Hermes. And the apostles are going to stop them and say, wait, we're just people. And everything is fine for a little while until some Jews come down from Iconium. Let's see if we can get that up here. Some Jews are going to come down from Iconium, and they're going to stone Paul. They're going to drag him outside of the city, and they're going to stone him. And then Paul is going to get back up and go into the city. After that, so when they had preached the gospel to that city and they had made many converts or disciples, you can see that here, they're going to return to Lystra and Iconium and Antioch, right? Going backwards through the journey that they just took. They're going to strengthen the disciples. They're going to encourage them to continue in the faith, saying that through many tribulations, we'll enter the kingdom of God. But then look at verse 23. So after they go through, they teach some more, they encourage people, they warn them that this is kind of what Christians can expect, this kind of treatment. It's going to say in verse 23, and when they had appointed elders for them in every church with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they have believed. So they entrusted them that they would continue faithfully to God and that God would direct them. But in order to make sure that these new churches that have been begun are going to stay faithful or stay at all, they're going to appoint elders for them in every church. And now you might see that translated a variety of ways. They're going to appoint elders for them from church to church. The idea here is it's a distributive appointment, right? So all these churches, they're all going to have elders. There's not a single person who is ruling over all of these different churches. That's an important point. And so what we see here is they've spent 3 years going through this region, bringing Christianity, converting people, teaching them, and then they're going to go back through and appoint elders. So if we assume that the first person converted is also the person who is going to be appointed an elder, the longest they could have been a Christian is about 3 years. Now that's significant because when we talk about somebody not being a recent convert, we typically don't think of somebody who's been a believer for only 3 years. In fact, in most congregations, if somebody was converted and then 3 years later they were put up to be a shepherd or an overseer of that congregation, most people would kind of have a problem with that. They say, wait, that's too soon. But that's exactly what's happening here. If the very first day on this journey, Paul converts somebody, and then later on the way back, on the very last day of the journey, converts them, they've only been a Christian for 3 years. And so this kind of helps us maybe to figure out what we're talking about when we say converted to whom. Could it be that what we're asking or what we're dealing with is somebody who is converted to God in general? And we see this actually among the Gentiles. When Paul will go around to different places and he'll preach at the synagogues, there will be phrases that you'll see crop up in your New Testament in the book of Acts, the God-fearing Gentiles. And so there are Gentiles who have already been converted to Yahweh, but they're still Gentiles. Maybe they haven't been circumcised, maybe they haven't fully integrated into the Jewish community. Whatever it is, they're still kind of seen as an outsider. And maybe even if they have done all those things, they're still seen as an outsider because the law will give you different periods of time before somebody is fully integrated into the Jewish people. And so there's a lot of different things that could be going on. But when we're talking about Yahweh, this is significant because Christians, when they're going around preaching in the ancient world, they're not preaching something new. And now, let me explain. When I say they're not preaching something new, what I mean is that they're preaching the fulfillment of something that has been written for around 1,500 years. When Moses begins writing the law in about 1450 BC or so, there's a whole bunch of promises that the Hebrew people have been carrying with them, but now they're recorded in the works of Moses. And so for about 1,500 years, there's this written body of promises, and the Christians are claiming that Jesus has come to fulfill those. So let's look at a couple places where we can see what I mean. So over in Romans chapter 1, we're going to see this. In Romans chapter 1, the Apostle Paul says that he's here in verse 1 to preach the gospel, right? He's an apostle, he's set apart for the gospel, and this gospel was promised beforehand through the prophets in the Holy Scriptures, right? Paul is claiming that the gospel is old. Now, it has been revealed newly, or it has been fulfilled recently, and so as far as the events of Moses, this is a much more recent occurrence, and in that sense it's new, but the promises themselves are very old. Right? The Christians would claim that these promises go all the way back to creation. Paul himself will say even before creation, before the foundation of the world, God has promised these things or planned these things in Jesus. Another place we can go is Jesus himself over in John chapter 5 and verse 39. Jesus says, "You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life." Speaking to the Pharisees and the Hebrew people, you're scouring through these because you think that it's going to take you to life. But they bear witness about me, right? And you refuse to come to me that you may have life. So Jesus himself is claiming that these ancient writings, ancient even to the point in time when he's speaking, these ancient writings are actually referring to him. And so he's claiming that what he's doing and who he is isn't something new, but it's actually something very old. It's the hope of Israel from the beginning, the hope of all humanity from the beginning. And there's a lot of other places we could go. There's a couple that we'll look at, just a couple more. One is over in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 19. The Apostle Peter is going to say, if we can type that in right, the Apostle Peter is going to say, "And we have the prophetic word more fully confirmed." And so here we've got the word prophetic highlighted, right? He's looking back at the prophets, the Old Testament scriptures. And so what he's saying is these things that were prophesied in the prophets are now being fulfilled or have been fulfilled in Jesus. We're seeing them fulfilled in the church, in all the things that are happening. Jesus himself is going to talk over in Luke chapter 21 about a coming judgment. He's going to say these are the days of vengeance to fulfill all that is written. Right? So the Christians go about preaching a a message of fulfillment. The gospel of Jesus is about the Lord keeping his promises and sending the Messiah and establishing this new kingdom and establishing a kingdom that will never be overthrown. Right? So the events are new, but the promises are old. And so the Christians, when they're going about promising this, telling these things, saying, hey, Jesus is the Messiah. He is the King. He is what God has been intending to do all along. Well, if you were a Jew, these are the very things that you have been looking for. If you were a faithful Jew, then when the gospel of Jesus is proclaimed, that's just a step forward for you. You have been trusting in Moses. You've been trusting in the prophets. You've been looking for the hope of Israel. And the message of Christianity is that hope has come in the person of Jesus. The Apostle Paul will say over in 2 Corinthians chapter 1 that all of God's promises find their yes in him. And so it's quite possible that if you have a Hebrew who has been faithful to the Lord and hears the gospel and believes that Jesus is the Messiah, well, he's not believing anything new except the identity of that Messiah. Now he knows who the Messiah is, or she knows who the Messiah is. And when they come over into faith, there's a sense in which they wouldn't be a new convert, right? They have been following this all along. Now, we're not in that same situation. We tend to have different things going on when it comes to local churches in the United States or other countries. We tend not to be in the exact same situation. Most people who are going to come to the Lord today without any prior knowledge or prior experience are not coming out of Judaism. Right? They're coming out of either atheism or some other religion. And in that sense, you would have a brand new convert. A freshly planted tree is the word picture that we have in recent convert, a recent plant. And if you were a Jew, that's not necessarily the case. So that helps us to kind of explain what may have been going on. The corollary or a similar situation to that may exist today is somebody who is raised in a faith or a family that believes that Jesus is the Messiah, but then they leave that and they come out of a denomination or out of some other group, and that person then might be more similar to somebody who was a Jew and was converted to Jesus or believed that Jesus was the Messiah. You know, they have been believing in Jesus, and in that sense, they're not converted to Christ, right? It's not a brand new idea to them. They might be very familiar with many of the things, but maybe there's some new information that they gained. And so when we start asking how do we apply this, that's where it's going to get a little tricky. And so when we begin to apply it, the reason why this matters, the reason why I think the idea of not a recent convert is in there's a few things. The first is biblical knowledge. If somebody has no idea who God is and is converted, and 3 weeks later they're made an elder, how can they know anything? Right? How can they know what to obey when they don't even know what is written? How can they know how to show that Jesus is the Messiah to the gainsayers when they don't even know what is written? Or you can't lead people in the way of the Lord when you have not yet walked the way of the Lord. That's really significant, and that's important. Another thing is that there's no outcome of faith yet. One of the things that you see in the letter to the Hebrews over in chapter 13, where it says, remember your leaders and imitate them and consider the outcome of their faith. So you know who they are, you know how they've been living, you know the way they've been walking, and you can see the result of somebody who is faithful to God. This is what their life looks like. Well, somebody who comes from no religious background and is a believer for only a short time, they really don't have an outcome of their faith yet. Right? They're still growing. It's all brand new. And so there's a real sense in which they can't lead you in the same way that somebody who has been a believer for many years, somebody who has been faithful for many years, they have this life to look on and say, wow, I can see when they were in this low spot and their faith carried them through, or they were in a difficult situation, but they trusted the Lord. I can see how they dealt with all of these different things that life throws at all of us, all these different temptations, the traps, the snares that Satan lays in front of all of us. And that kind of gets us then to the next thing, is that satanic attacks, right, demonic attacks, the wiles of Satan, as Paul will say over in Ephesians chapter 6, are real things, right? Their temptation is a very real thing. And one of the temptations is that if you are a brand new believer and all of a sudden you're made a leader, even if you're brilliant, maybe you just have an incredible memory and you memorize the entire Bible in 2 weeks and you're just very, very good at applying things and you've got all this figured out. There's a really big temptation for you to become prideful. And one of the things that Paul says over in 1 Timothy chapter 3 is that this is not a good thing because it will cause people to fall into this snare of Satan. You can look in the text that we have. He says he must not be a recent convert, and then he gives you the reason why. I really like it when Paul says something and then tells us why it's important. And so the other things that we said are true, but here is the primary reason why Paul says they can't be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. And the condemnation of the devil there is probably pride. Right? It was Satan's pride that led him into rebelling. It's the pride of those spiritual beings that led them to try and be gods themselves instead of submitting as servants of the Most High God. And so the idea here is, if you take somebody who is a brand new convert, regardless of how brilliant they are, knowledgeable, wise, any of those things, if you take somebody who's a brand new convert and you begin to put them into leadership positions, you run the very real danger of causing them to become conceited. Of filling them full of themselves to the point where they are going to incur the same condemnation. They're going to think that they're right because it's their idea, rather than listening to other people, considering the scriptures, praying, allowing God to teach them, all the things that we see mature people doing throughout the text of the New Testament, all the things that the letters in the New Testament call upon believers to do. This person is in a very real, dangerous position where those things may no longer occur. And now you have somebody who is imitating the devil rather than imitating the Christ, leading a local church, and that's a bad thing. And so we have to be very careful that we realize that these things, these attacks, these temptations, they're very real. A final note before we go is, again, we have to apply this, like other things, in wisdom. Not all people have the same background. Not all people have the same abilities. Not all people have the same circumstances. And as we've seen in Acts chapter 14, it's very likely that people who were already following God faithfully, but now they have learned more fully, those people are appointed much more quickly than somebody who is coming out of no knowledge of God and coming into faith. And so we have people who at the longest range would be about 3 years of time. And that would not be normal today, I don't believe. Somebody who has no knowledge of God and is converted, and then 3 years later they're a shepherd, that would be odd. But what might happen is somebody who has been faithfully serving the Lord, and maybe a Jewish person today is faithfully serving the Lord, but then when they're a little older, they're converted. They might become a shepherd in a much shorter span of time than somebody who is an atheist and is converted. You just have to look at the person. You have to look at the entire person and how this fits into their overall character. Are they somebody who's given to pride anyway? Well, then maybe wait a little bit longer for them. Are they somebody who has been faithfully serving God, but now they've learned the way more accurately? Well, it'd probably take that person less time to kind of figure everything out because they're already serving the Lord faithfully their entire life. And so with many of the things that we're going to discuss, the rub is that I can't give you a number. I can't tell you that somebody is no longer a recent convert after 17 years of being a believer. I can't do that because the New Testament doesn't do that. And again, we see people who are appointed as shepherds in a really short period of time, 3 years. And in my experience, that's not ever happened. I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's never happened in my personal experience. And so again, with all of these things, we have to apply the passage in wisdom, thinking about the entire person, whether we would consider them to be a recent convert, whether we would consider them to be somebody in danger of falling into that condemnation of the devil. And that has to weigh into our decision. So it's been a blessing to go through this with you all. We're going to continue looking at some other aspects of shepherds, some character qualities and traits of shepherds. God bless you, and we'll see you all next time.